Can everyone hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you. This is Suzanne Lemieux with the American Petroleum Institute. I appreciate the opportunity to present to you all today. This has been a pretty interesting process over the last 6 months to develop this handbook that we hope will be useful for not just our members and the oil and natural gas industry, but for all of those working at the state level as well. To go into a bit of background for the handbook, why we developed the handbook. After Sandy, or during Sandy, to give you a little more background on myself, I was actually at the Department of Energy working as part of ESS 12 during the response to Sandy, as well as the response to Ike and Gustav in 2008, Hurricane Irene in 2011, I believe. And so Sandy was obviously different somewhat from those storms and the impact, the impacted area, etc. And we saw during that response and in the aftermath to that response that the issues weren't necessarily problems, but it was more a lack of effective communication, a lack of the right information in the right hands at the right time with the right understanding of what that information meant. And so from the industry's perspective, we decided that developing a better understanding for our members of what that communication process really should be, how it really should work, would be a great benefit for those members operating facilities that were affected, as well as those who might be affected in future storms. So we worked with the White House and several other federal agencies to define what the process was supposed to be. There's a lot of different documentation out there and processes such as I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, such as the National Response Framework, the Incident Command Structure, the new PBD-8 that came out in 2012 that discussed what response should be. So we tried to document that and put it in front of these agencies to say, this is the way that it's laid out, is this how it actually works? And it turned out that a lot of people said yes, but they all did it a little differently. And so what we attempted to do with this group was to simplify what that process should be, come to agreement that they all felt it was the same, and then let our members know where they could come into that process. And this hopefully will help at the local level where response should be happening, but also at the federal level where people really need the information to make those larger regional or federal decisions that affect response. And another specific example of where we saw the problem was the focus on retail gas availability during the response to Sandy. There was constantly a focus on gasoline at gas stations, but not the actual problem, which was issues with terminals, issues with supply into those terminals, and then getting that supply from terminals to retail gas stations, whether it was an issue with the transportation infrastructure such as blocked roads or with retail electric power at those gas stations. And so that really revealed to us a lack of understanding of our industry and how the system works. So from that, we developed a handbook with the Oil and Natural Gas Sector Coordinating Council, other trades, to lay out a strategy for how to engage stakeholders, whether it be public officials, interdependent sectors, or the consumer. And so this handbook we've sent out to NASEO, to our federal partners, to our state petroleum councils, which are across the country, and our partner state organizations, to really help get this message out there that education of the process and of the system itself are what it can lead to the best and most effective communication during an event. And this is not made for just a hurricane. It's made for really any disruptive event. Because a lot of the states obviously aren't going to see hurricanes, but they may see flooding, ice storms, tornadoes, etc., that can affect infrastructure, and will have the same, what we hope will be process-driven event rather than response driven by the event itself not following a process, which doesn't lead to the best outcome. So I'm not going to read from the slides because I think that you all can read them for yourselves when you get them, but it has a few key components. A strategy of how, as an industry, the oil and gas industry, we want to address preparedness and response. 2 supply chains, one for oil and one for natural gas, that really lays out in a simplistic manner how these supply chains work, what are their critical components, and that makes it really easy when explaining to people where there are issues, what place in the system it is, and then you can see the downstream or potentially upstream impacts from that. We found that extremely helpful. A process that I just was referring to earlier that we agreed to with other federal agencies about how that communication between government and the industry should work. Guidance for preparing to state and local levels, which I think will be of specific interest to NASEO members, and identification of waivers that are often needed, whether from the state or from the federal level, and how those affect different components of the system, because it can be often an impediment to restoration when an event occurs. So we felt it was important to point those out. So the strategy itself really focuses on 2 main components, and those are the importance of educating stakeholders about how the system works, what's critical in the system, and why they need to be cognizant of those issues, and then formalizing this process of communication. So information during an event, as some of you may have experienced, the chaos that comes about during an event is really from a lack of information or a lack of understanding what that information means. At the local level, obviously there are a lot of impacts from such events as hurricanes or tornadoes, but those can typically be dealt with in a process-oriented way, whether it's getting supplies in, getting people out, removing debris, etc. But it's the constant churn for information that really impedes people's restoration processes, or even to get in and analyze what damage there may be. If you're constantly getting calls to find out what's happening, that can cause a lot of issues, as we've seen in the past. And so it's this understanding of the information you get and how to get it that's really critical. And that's what the strategy really looks at, is how can we go out and educate our stakeholders in advance? How do we easily explain a very complex system in a complex market? Because for oil and natural gas, these are very complex and very competitive markets, and that's what a lot of people don't understand when an event happens and people are looking for supplies, because those are often contracted out and not available for dissemination to wherever it may be needed. Well, that's a complicated issue, so we'll get into that in a bit. This is the supply chain itself. And so what we've done here is really break down the oil supply chain into discrete components that are easily recognizable, easily understood. This is obviously not a full system map, but it does break down to the key components that people need to be aware of when an event happens. You can point to a specific point in the system and say, for instance, at the terminal, if the terminals are impacted, then supply is not going to be able to get to those retail gas stations, which is point of sale in this particular graphic. And so we found this really effective. This is for you to share and use as you want to. Hopefully you'll find it helpful. There's also a natural gas supply chain, which is very similar to this, but obviously a different system. And so the section on understanding the supply chain really just goes into some more detail using those models to say where do federal agencies and states engage in these different components to understand what the impacts are, what type of assessments are needed at these different components to be able to begin restoration, to understand what the impacts are, whether it's for physical damage, personnel safety, etc. There's a lot that goes into bringing these components back into service when an event happens, and that's something that people need to understand when recovery begins. The next section, the national response coordination process, is the process that I was describing earlier between our members in the federal family to understand and map out how does communication occur. And so from our perspective, we wanted to make this as simple as possible for our members in our industry. There's a lot more that goes on in the public side as far as how the information is routed, where it's collected, how it's analyzed, where it goes. From a private sector perspective, that internal government process is less relevant to us. We need to know how do we get information out and how do we give it in. And there are really only 3 levels that's done at: locally, at the state level, and at the federal level. And so what we have been encouraging through this whole process is to really understand that all response is local. And so we begin at the local level, move to the state, and then potentially if it's a regional level, up to the federal, but still the response is going to occur at the local level. And that's where our facility owners are empowered to do what they need to do to restore services. The difference between oil and gas and a lot of other sectors, and particularly what we're usually compared with is the electric sector, is that oil and gas at the facility level is much more empowered to get what they need, whether it's supplies, personnel, etc., in order to restore their operations than potentially other electric utilities who may need to get mutual aid, who may need government assistance to bring those things in. Our industry is a bit more self-contained, and that we often have those contracts set up in place and the ability at the facility level to request those without having to go into upper management. So to be able to respond at the local level is very important. This section on preparing at the state and local levels, we really developed this initially for our state petroleum councils, which are located in 26 states, and we have partnerships with regional and state associations in the rest of the country. We wanted to make sure that those petroleum councils were prepared for an event if one were to happen, and then lay out some simple steps and guidelines for how they could go about finding who they needed to talk to within their state, what the resources were they needed to be aware of that may be critical, and how to engage through exercises, whether it was with their companies or with the state or local governments, to make sure that those relationships and processes were the right ones. And so some of our state petroleum councils, for instance, in New Jersey and Florida, are pretty well versed, pretty well practiced in how to do that. But generally, it's not necessarily well known that you need to have a relationship with your state emergency manager, or you need to know how to get into the state EOC in an event if there's a lot of oil and gas critical infrastructure in your region and it's going to have a large impact on the populace if it were somehow put out of operation in an event. And so hopefully, I know a lot of you who developed your state energy response plans are having similar conversations, attempting to establish similar relationships, and also attempting to identify what in your state is critical. And hopefully these partnerships between the state councils and the other associations, the marketers associations, there are gas associations at the state level, that really this handbook will help them work with you and vice versa, that you would see what they're attempting to do and can engage at the same level. So there are a couple of key parts of that document. First is know who does what. Who in your state is critical? Who's going to be granting waivers at the state level? Who's going to be in charge of emergency operations? Who would be in charge if there were road closures? How would you get your personnel through? These are just some of the relationships that as an operator should be in place so that you know in an event who you need to talk to and who can make the decisions that can help you restore service. Another big component of that is know what not to do. In our competitive markets, antitrust is a pretty significant issue that we need to be sensitive to. Companies are not going to share information with each other. They're not going to share them with trade associations such as our API. We're not allowed to collect that information. We're not allowed to analyze that information. We have very strict rules around how that information is shared. And so an individual company can share with the state, but they're not going to share publicly, and they're not going to share with each other. And so there's a lot of questions around supplies at terminals, who those belong to, how can they be distributed. Those are generally all contracted supplies. There is some spot market buying that is another complex part that people don't often understand. And so looking at how that information be shared and understanding that a lot of time it can't be, but if you have relationships with those operators, they may be able to explain those things to you. That's very important at the state level before an event happens, so that if an event were to happen, you wouldn't be caught off guard and you wouldn't have to say, well, I know there's gas there. Why isn't it being released? Because it is a complicated market. And we're not going to be able to help in that matter because of antitrust. So then the third component of that is to know what matters. There may be 20 terminals in your area. There may be one that's really critical, that has the most amount of fuel or has what may be required fuel at that time, and that's when a waiver might come in place to let other fuel be released. But it's really knowing, is there a critical pipeline that runs through your area that's supplying possibly another state, but if there's a shutdown in that other state, it may affect the supplies that you get. So you really want to be aware of what's in your region or in your state and how it can affect you. And then the best way to know if you have the right information from those last three steps and what you can do is to practice, to have exercises. I know also in the Energy Response Plan grants that exercises were required. We hope that you're reaching out and engaging our industry, but we also are encouraging our industry members to reach out to you to engage, because there are a lot of practices within exercises held within companies, and so the better those can be coordinated or at least discussed between states and the operators within those states, the more effective they can be and the more realistic they can be, hopefully. So the last section is potential waivers. And this just is a long list of federal and state waivers that are common during events that really help operators restore more quickly if they can be waived, with due diligence that needs to be done, of course, to allow, for instance, driver hours of service limitations can be lifted. You can have people crossing state borders to get into affected areas. Weight limits is part of that if you're bringing heavy equipment in to aid in your restoration. There are a lot of state-level waivers that are pretty important to speeding the process of restoration. And so we've done kind of a laundry list of what those are and what the waiver is. So there are a lot of people who are not familiar with that, but it is an important component of restoration. So we wanted to make sure we highlighted that in the plan. In conclusion, I think, and I hope to have a discussion about this. I don't know how many people have had a chance to glance through the handbook. It is on our website, but we've also distributed it quite broadly. This is not a document that is going to provide a step-by-step process of how to recover or even how to reach out to people or how to plan that exercise. This is a common sense set of best practices and guidances that are going to help people understand what they need to do before an event occurs. It's not anything that commits our members to specific actions. It doesn't commit the government to specific actions, and it's not committing states to specific actions. It's a way that hopefully encourages people to talk to each other and establish those important relationships before an event. And again, to go back to the strategy, it really is meant as an educational tool and a way to push the importance of a process for sharing information when an event occurs. As I said, the biggest challenge is getting the right information and understanding what it means. And if we can do those things, between the public and private sector will take a lot of the stress out of an event and really help speed up the process of recovery. So I've also included here a couple of links to our handbook, 2 presentations for the oil and natural gas supply chains respectively that have a lot of really good information in those. I've linked to documents that we think are really helpful for the state and for our operators to understand, which is the Petroleum Shortage Supply Management NASEO document that goes through what some of those contracting issues are when it comes to contracted fuels, spot fuel, market fuels. It's something that is a very probably banal topic to some people, but really will become critical in an event, because if you're needing supplies and you don't have those contracted already from a state perspective, that can cause a lot of issues for your first responders, for those critical people who may need fuel to get somewhere, who may need fuel for generators. So understanding what those markets are and what those contracts are required is going to be very critical at the local level. And then the last document deals with the waivers that might be needed at the state level. I've also included, as a last resource, we've developed an app for the iPad here at API that takes the oil supply chain and overlays a lot of what is in the preparedness document in an interactive format that really helps communicate this easily, on the go, to whoever you might interact with. You don't have to carry around paper copies. We're also able to update this app if an event were to occur that would have critical information, whether it was from FEMA, from NOAA, from the White House, and that can all be updated in real time. And so we feel this is a really effective tool to communicate. I'd like to show it to you here, but unfortunately this format, it doesn't work out. But it's free in the iTunes App Store. If you want to go and download it, you just search for W2W, and it is the supply chain. It shows those engagements. It shows those assessments over all the components of the supply chain. It goes into where the waivers come into those components, and then it gives some resources for where to go and who to talk to if some type of disruptive event occurs. And so we really think this moving forward is how we're going to be best able to educate people about our industry, about how the system works, and about a lot of the things they should be considering before an event happens, hopefully, but during an event it would also be a very effective tool. So I know I went through that pretty quickly. I apologize, I'm a bit of a fast talker, but I'm happy to take any questions you have, and hope that you are able to use this document in the future. You know, hopefully there are no hurricanes, but if there were, this would be hopefully useful, or any other storms. So with that, Jeff, I'll turn it back over to you.
Hey, thank you very much for that presentation, Suzanne. It was very helpful. We'll open it up for questions now. I didn't see any questions come in the chat box. Did you have anything that came in, Shamika?
Yes, Mark Want actually had a couple of questions that he typed. The first is, where is the list of all API state petroleum councils? He's looking for point of contacts at the state level.
Okay, if you can get me his contact information, I can provide that. We don't have it online, but I can get it to him. Okay, great. And then the next question he had was, where are the western states? It seems that API is not involved in the West. Is there similar coordination with these states? I can say that yes, our Director of State Relations was just talking, gave a presentation on this other day, but they are directly linked to WSPA, which is the Western States Petroleum Association, as well as the other state oil and gas associations in the West, as well as the U.S. Oil and Gas Station, which covers a lot of the South. There is direct coordination. These products have been shared through our state relations out to those other associations. We have considered them when going through this process. We do believe that they will be able to use this as well. API is engaged, but I can certainly get him in touch with our state relations if he wants more information.
Great. I have a question from Lillian Huffman. Can we get more detailed information on what specific elements of a regulation needs to be waived, especially those relating to safety, so that safety isn't entirely compromised?
Sure. I think we'd have to get a little more detailed into that question. I mean, every state's regulations are different, and so it'd probably be a case-by-case basis, but I'm sure we could work through that. If she has some specific state in mind, or I mean, it's a bit of a question for the lawyers, but I can certainly facilitate that discussion. That's not a direct answer, but.
Yeah, I could answer a little bit to that point. If it's regarding the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, the guidance that we have on the NASEO website on the energy security page under resources does go into some depth about how the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulation waivers work. And one of the problems that exist with those waivers is there's many people that believe that they can waive just the driver hour component of the waiver. But however, the fact of the matter is the way the federal law is written, the waiver applies to the entire safety section of those regulations. So that if a governor declares a state of emergency or state of disaster, that declaration is automatically viewed by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration as an emergency declaration that will cause those waivers of the safety regulations to automatically go into effect. And so at least with that particular set of waivers, it's really governed by federal law, and the way in which the federal law recognizes the governor's declaration is the foundation for initiating those waivers, even without any explicit further actions by the states. So take a look at that guidance on the website, and if people have further questions on that, I'm certainly available. You can contact me. Shamika, do we have any other questions on the chat?
I don't see any additional questions.
All right. If people do have further questions this time and would like to raise their hand, we can unmute their phones. While you're considering, if you have further questions, just a couple of follow-up points I'd like to make from Suzanne's remarks, and I really appreciate her taking the time today to share this information with us. We will be distributing a copy of the handbook to the Energy Security Committee for NASEO, as well as we'll be sending it out to all the state energy assurance, energy emergency assurance coordinators and state energy assurance planners. We'll do that either later today or tomorrow, so that will be available to you. As Suzanne mentioned, this document is a good foundation for you to perhaps initiate some further dialogue with the petroleum industries within your states, and I would encourage you to do so. It really does complement the petroleum shortage supply management options that we've identified in that document for states to give consideration to. That is in addition to those things which are already articulated within the state energy assurance guidelines. I think the comments about the antitrust issues are something that, you know, is probably not as well understood by some as it might be. It's important to know that unlike the electric and gas industries, which have a more centralized control and operation system, the antitrust requirements inhibit oil companies from sharing information with one another, and this means that the only viable alternative that you have at a state level to understand the severity of any given problem is for you to aggregate data from individual companies to provide a more complete picture of the information in your state and the status of supplies within your state, as well as to, you know, coordinate with those states within your region who are also in many instances relying on that same distribution network to supply their fuel supplies as well. So that communication with the industry, that consolidation of information, and that regional coordination are important aspects of this work. And it is important that states have good working relationship with the API and the local jobber group in your state, so that you can undertake those assessments in a timely fashion and to make sure that you've accurately characterized the nature of the problem. So I certainly encourage you to take a look at those things. please feel free to share this document with others. You may wish to provide some additional briefings at your own state level, and it may afford an opportunity to have some further dialogue again with the petroleum sector in your states and looking at your state energy assurance plans and the petroleum contingencies that you have within those plans. So just some further thoughts. And Shamika, do we have any other questions that have turned up at this point?
No, we don't.
Okay. Well, if there are no further questions, I think this will be concluding our webinar for today. If you do have further questions on this that come up later, feel free to contact me. We can also provide you with Suzanne's contact information, and again, we'll be getting that handbook out to everybody here very shortly as well. So if there's not anything further, I'd like to again thank Suzanne Lemieux for her presentation today, and this will conclude today's webcast. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.